Hello there and welcome to a brand new episode of the SportsPro podcast. My name is George Breare. I'm head of events content here at SportsPro. And today, to kick off a new podcast for a brand new year, is SportsPro's off-platform editor Tom Bassam and SportsPro's features editor Sam Carp. Sam and Tom, it's good to be joined by you as always.
Nice to be back. Happy New Year, everybody. Happy New Year, Sam.
Yeah, Happy New Year, guys. Any resolutions?
Apart from the truly original lose weight and be more healthy, not a huge amount. I'm not typically very good at sticking to them. What about you?
I think I might just jump on the SportsPro wide detox that seems to be happening. First day back in the office today and everyone seems to be on it and I feel a bit left out. So I'm probably going to get involved in that one, mate.
Well, the packet of biscuits that I brought into this podcast recording probably haven't helped with any of our detoxes. But Tom, what about you?
I am going to try and run at least once a week in the morning. I'm usually more of an evening runner, but it's always a bit dark and grim and it's always a good excuse to not do it. So I feel like maybe if I try and make myself do it in the morning,
It's also dark and grim?
Yeah, but getting lighter. I'm running towards the light, whereas in the evening, I'm very much running towards the dark. So, we'll see how that goes. But I'm going to take it a month at a time. Month-long resolutions, not annual ones, I think.
Yeah, I like that. I've always feel as if I do have a resolution, dry January. Another truly original one, but I'm 3 days in and still going strong. But I always feel like my New Year's resolutions are slightly an overreaction to my Christmas indulgence. Did you both have good Christmases?
Yeah, can't complain. I mean, indulgence is also very much the word. I feel like, I feel like I came back and I don't want to weigh myself yet. But there was, I put away a fair amount over Christmas. It's probably not nothing to be proud of.
You're supporting the local economies and the farmers around the country, Tom.
Yeah,
particularly the chocolatiers that are around the British.
Yeah. The Baby Bell and Bernard Matthew industries are going to be particularly happy. Other turkeys and cheeses are available, of course.
Someone's got to do it. What about you, Sam? I know you headed over to the North American shores.
Yeah, that was just before Christmas, actually. Went out to Vancouver, did a bit of skiing, stuck to the green slopes because I hadn't been for about 15 years. But good fun. Got her onto a Canucks game as well. So, a very sport-filled trip to Canada just before the break.
We missed you in the pre-Christmas quiz, and we could have actually done with some of that North American sporting knowledge, particularly when it came to hockey. A few questions that stumped even the finest minds that SportsPro has to offer. Yeah,
that's part of why I'm back. I think I had to kind of set the record straight after Ed Dixon's appearance seemed to strip Steve McCaskill and I of our title that we won very well the year before. So I'll have to make sure that I don't book leave in December this year.
You're essentially the equivalent of the SportsPro podcast stabilizers on the bicycle. Without that, it's just a runaway train down the hill. One pothole away from a couple of broken arms. Well, speaking of the finest minds that the sports industry has to offer, this week, in the ever-growing trend of New Year, New X, SportsPro has announced who our editorial team think will be the top 10 influencers of 2024. Sam, can you run me through some of the names this year and any notable ones that you've pulled out?
I guess I'll just start with a bit of context. We'll basically just pick out 10 people who we think are going to kind of be setting the agenda over the next 12 months in the sports industry. Typically, about half of them tend to resign before the end of the year. But
poison chalice.
Yeah, we're hoping that won't be the case in 2024. So a really interesting mix this year of kind of league commissioners, broadcast executives, tech founders, investors, etc. Drum roll, please. Perfect. So the 10 influencers of 2024 we think are going to be Jay Monahan, who is the commissioner of the PGA Tour, Amélie Oudéa-Castéra, who is the French Minister for Sport and obviously will be playing a prominent role in the Paris 2024 Olympic and Paralympic Games, Lionel Messi, won't say his job title, probably don't need to, Kathy Engelbert, the WNBA commissioner, Jimmy Pitaro, who is the chairman of ESPN, Nikki Doucet, who is the new chief executive of the Women's Super League NUCO, which was formed at the end of last year, Danny Townsend, chief executive of SRJ Sports Investments, which was the new fund set up by Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, Marina Storti, chief executive of WTA Ventures, Sam Altman, who is the chief executive of OpenAI, and last but not least, Anil Jayaraj, who is the chief executive of Viacom 18 Sports.
It's quite a list there, isn't there, Tom? I thought we'd start with this year's biggest major event, partly because I'd like to humble brag that I have luckily got some tickets. But Let's start with Amélie Oudéa-Castéra, the French sports minister. It's a big year for France, hosting, of course, the world's biggest sporty event in the Summer Olympics. However, it's not been plain sailing always up to now. So what, Tom, do you think are some of the challenges that Amélie faces, but also the opportunities for 2024?
I mean, I think as ever, when we kind of look at this list, it's always a bit of a proxy generally for a major event or a significant thing. And there is nothing probably much more significant still in the sporting calendar than the Olympic Games. But this Olympic Games feels, I mean, maybe this is pure Western bias, but it feels a little bit kind of more, well, back in the ballpark for the traditional industry, I guess. Like, we're in a major European country, one of the capital cities in the world.
I recently found out, actually, Paris is the most visited city in the world.
Well, there you go.
New Year's Eve trivia question coming back with a vengeance.
Probably the most visited city this summer as well, I'd imagine.
Yeah. Solidifying its position.
Only set to increase. But the Olympic Games have had some difficult times, I think, with some of the previous hosts. Just in terms of attracting attention, I mean, Tokyo was massively hit by the pandemic. Whereas this should and hopefully will be a bit of a return to form.
BAU. Business as usual.
All right. Thank you for that sports business acronym that I had no idea about. Yeah, so this should be a bit of a return to form. But as you said, it's not been without challenges. They're trying to transform the Olympics for a modern era in a time where really we can't be building just great monuments to sport which get abandoned afterwards. See Rio 2016. This, for Paris, has all been about trying to make an Olympics which is in some ways sustainable, using a lot of existing facilities, but also a chance to upgrade their transfer infrastructure, which has had mixed success. The mayor recently accepted that probably wasn't going to be done in time. We've had the arguments over the involvement of Russian and Belarusian athletes, which seems to have been going on for about 10 years now with the IOC. And similarly, against the kind of backdrop of some pretty serious civil unrest in France in the last 18 months or so, and even more recently, some pretty horribly violent attacks. So, as ever, I mean, a lot of scrutiny gets placed on Olympic host cities, but yeah, for Paris, it probably really feels under the glare. And as the sports minister overseeing it, yeah, she's going to be one of the kind of the prominent faces in the Olympic Games. And if it goes well, then this is going to be a big moment for her. If she doesn't, your legacy can sink with it, as I think we saw in Japan.
A lot of people probably, in a sports-related sense anyway, would have heard of Amélie Oudéa-Castéra around the 2022 Champions League final, when famously the match had to be delayed at Stade de France because of the trouble that Liverpool fans had getting into the stadium from outside, and the way that they dealt with that in the aftermath. The French government and also UEFA blaming it on Liverpool supporters rather than basically the organisation of the event itself. So it will kind of be interesting to see, what they've learned from that experience, given that the Olympics is going to put a whole another level of strain on Paris's infrastructure rather than just a one-off football final. I think, based on how she dealt with that situation, you could almost argue that, a reputation is on the line here, really, in terms of how France delivers this Olympics. And yeah, whether it is successful and whether some of those hiccups have been overcome.
Yeah, I mean, they had some similar issues actually during the Rugby World Cup with some of the games in Marseille, with violence at the Stade de France and policing there, and having experienced watching football in France, I still don't think they've learned the lessons in terms of policing those crowds. I mean, Marseille is a unique place, and this event isn't happening in Marseille, it's happening in Paris. But at the same time, those pressures will exist. And if the world sees some of the kind of methods and techniques that the French police use to deal with crowds, I think are fairly antiquated for 2023. And if the world sees that, it's not going to be good. While it has all the potential for raising her status and being something that she can really look back on, if it goes wrong in a major way, and in a major way that not just actually is major for sport, but is a major kind of cultural moment as well. So many people watch the Olympics that don't even day-to-day engage with sport. So all eyes on Paris.
When it comes to organising teams, it's almost the case of no news is good news, right? When it comes to the execution of the event, as long as all eyes and attention stays on the sports and, I guess the sporting integrity, then actually it's usually a job pretty well done.
Yeah, I think so. And we should probably clarify that she's not the only one responsible for organising this Olympics. There's a whole local organising committee. There's a CEO of that organising committee. Obviously, the IOC will play a part as well. She's not the only one that the buck stops with, but obviously, as Tom said, she is one of the most prominent figures in the organisation of that event. And I guess it's also in terms of the strain it will place on the infrastructure. I suppose, you have to, a football match is kind of a very different kind of event to the Olympics. Obviously, people have their allegiances, and it's a good opportunity to sort of express national identity and sort of national pride and that kind of thing. But at the same time, it's probably maybe even a little less partisan, dare I say, than a Champions League final, and you won't have sort of like the same sort of split of supporters going into massive venues like that. So perhaps it will be slightly easier to manage sort of once the event is up and running. But yeah, I think the next few months in particular will be crucial in ensuring that, you know, Paris is ready to deliver on time.
I wanted to talk still on the subject of geopolitics, but certainly 2023, I think will be seen as a pretty important sliding doors moment for Saudi Arabia's involvement in the sports ecosystem, and certainly the year that major moves are made. And two people on this list that I think represent some of those interesting moves. One is Jay Monahan, the commissioner from the PGA Tour, and the second is Danny Townsend in that new role as chief executive of SRJ Sports Investments. Sam, let's start with Danny before we move on to the PGA Live merger talks and the recently announced extension of those. So can you just give me a brief bit of background into what SRJ Sports Investments is, why it's been set up, and some of the things it's looking to achieve?
Everyone knows that Saudi Arabia has been one of the most prominent investors in sport over the past few years. I don't think anyone's really bought a seat at sports top table as quickly as Saudi Arabia has. But I guess all of that investment to date, there hasn't really been a sort of, you know, we associate kind of investment coming from that part of the world in recent years. You think of dedicated sports funds like Qatar Sports Investments. And essentially this is kind of, I suppose, Saudi Arabia's equivalent of that. I think it's the best way to describe it. So whereas the funding so far has been coming from the Public Investment Fund, the Public Investment Fund is still the primary investor in SRJ Sports Investments, but it's just kind of, you know, a dedicated division within that now to sort of funnel those investments through.
Why do you think they have gone with that structure, given that the Public Investment Fund or PIF is the majority shareholder in Newcastle, is leading the sort of the PGA Live mergers, obviously the majority shareholder of Live Golf? Why now, and why has there been that need to set up a subsidiary that's specifically focused on sports when, for all intents and purposes, PIF is a major player in the sports ecosystem?
I think there's probably a few reasons. I think it's probably a way to sort of focus attention on sport specifically. The Public Investment Fund obviously invests in a ton of businesses, not only in sport, but across a wide variety of sectors. And also I think every time that the Public Investment Fund does invest in something in sport, there's a certain stigma attached to it. And people immediately sort of link that investment to the Saudi Arabian government, as you would. But I think now, if you're sort of setting up a specific division to invest in sports with a kind of familiar face from the sports industry fronting it in Danny Townsend, I think that kind of will potentially start to play a role in changing perceptions a little bit. And I think kind of the perception around Saudi investment in the past year or so has maybe started to shift slightly, whereas, you know, previously it was pretty much universally met with outrage every time that Saudi Arabia was investing in something and people were criticizing it as sports washing. I think there's a little bit more of like a resignation now that this is the way things are, and that, you know, sport is big business that's, you know, that is there to be sold to the highest bidder, and Saudi Arabia has been that on a lot of occasions. And I kind of do think that SRJ Sports Investments is essentially the next step in formalizing those investments a little bit more, but also kind of changing perceptions around the way Saudi is investing in sport. Yeah.
Also, I mean, it serves a kind of dual purpose, doesn't it? So, like, if you've got SRJ Sports Investments and a team or a property which is owned by SRJ Sports Investments does a deal with another brand which is backed by the Public Investment Fund, if it's owned by SRJ Sports Investments and the brand is owned by PIF or a further subsidiary of PIF, you can remove, at least to a degree, some of that conflict of interest. I mean, definitely in terms of like... And
legislation, such as you see in the Premier League.
Exactly where I was going with that. It's that degree of separation to say, look, these are different things. This is owned by SRJ. This is backed by the PIF. It's the model that they really successfully pursued in Abu Dhabi with City Football Group. And a lot of the investments that the Abu Dhabi state has partners of different bits of the City Football Group. But because of the way in which those businesses are set up, whilst pretty much anyone with two brain cells can go like, oh, well, that's their cousin on the board of this thing and that's their uncle on the board of this thing. It looks obvious, but legally there's enough separation there for people to be like, okay, well, not much you can do.
I know that since its establishment, the SRJ's the most notable deal from last year was the $100 million investment into the Professional Fighters League, the PFL, First League. What do you see as sort of the ramifications in that deal or the goals of that deal? And secondly, I'm asking you to go full Nostradamus here, Sam, but are you anticipating any major investments from SRJ in the coming months?
Definitely anticipating some major investments from them in the coming months. Where exactly those are, I'm not entirely sure. I think it would be interesting to see sort of what kind of approach they take, because I think those sort of Saudi Arabia's kind of flagship bigger investments in sport, I think, are still likely to be almost like under the guise of PIF, in the sense of like PGA Tour, for example. And I think SRJ Sports Investments will be more about investing in things that are going to grow sport in the MENA region specifically. So which is kind of what that PFL deal is about, I think. But also in the sense that by investing in the PFL, they're also investing in a property that has big ambitions of sort of rivaling the UFC. That's one way for Saudi Arabia to kind of cement itself in that sport as well. And we've seen Saudi Arabia invest quite significantly in combat sports already through boxing. So it kind of feeds into that side of things and complements that as well. Townsend specifically, obviously, is kind of his background's in, he came from the A-Leagues and also in Australia, and also has been at Nielsen before. So I guess he does kind of have experience of like the APAC market, and also, sort of working closely to MENA anyway. So I suppose it'd be interesting to see what sort of like their priorities are, where they choose to invest, what properties they go after. I know that cricket has been one that Saudi Arabia as a country has been heavily linked with. So maybe we'll see them make some investments there in the next few months, which I'm sure I've seen your ears perk up with that, George. But I think it'll be interesting to see the strategy in terms of investments on a sort of local versus global level.
Well, let's talk about one of those investments on the global level. Jay Monahan's currently the commissioner of the PGA Tour. There is obviously a lot of newsworthy elements to that, particularly given the recent extension that was allowed between the Live Golf Circuit and the PGA Tour in their merger discussions. I know that the 31st of December 2023 was the initial deadline that was set, but that has now been extended indefinitely. And I believe the quote is that it's hoped to be completed in 2024, which suggests that there is maybe trouble in paradise there.
What usually happens when we put out the 10 influencers list is by about the 10th of January, something's happened in order that one of those 10 influencers is no longer relevant. And actually, in this case, Jay Monahan's handed us a gift by deciding to extend his level of influence further into 2024. So it no longer expires on the 31st of last year, which thank you, Jay. But I've seen loose timelines for this. I think one was by the time that the Players starts, which is in a few months' time. But yeah, as you said, George, like, it doesn't bode well for the deal. The fact that they've already got a set of agreements in place with the SSG that perhaps came as a result of being prompted by the PIF. And I kind of thought when John Rahm made his kind of major defection just before Christmas, that was a sign that, the deal's probably quite close, because if that kind of thing happens and John Rahm thinks that he's going to be able to maybe still compete on the PGA Tour post-deal, he's made the jump at the right time.
But you wouldn't be making a $400 million investment if you're imminently going to merge with property that you prize someone from.
Maybe, maybe not. But I mean, it could also have been a way of being like, look, we're still about and we can still do this to you. If you want to get a deal done, let's do it quickly, because otherwise this will keep on happening. And it's like, that's quite a heavy threat in golf. That's been the biggest probably shot across the bows. It's certainly the biggest shot across the bows since those talks got underway. What stood out to me is the lack of noise. All we've really heard is delay, and not much else. There's not much in terms of like what the sticking points are in the talks, what kind of each side wants from the deal. Greg Norman seems to have popped that back up again after I wrote him off as an irrelevance about a year ago.
That's why you lit the fire under him that really motivated him to get back on the scene.
Yeah, well, he's the reason he's not on this influencers list. It's kind of strange in that regard. Like usually when a deal's rumbling away in the background, you get whispers, and that hasn't really been the case here, apart from the fact that it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. I think the closest thing we heard was that Patrick Cantlay, one of the stars of the US Ryder Cup team, was one of the people who was holding this up, and then that came out that had to be denied. It's very strange. And it actually just leaves golf in limbo at a time when it can't really afford to be in limbo anymore. There needs to be a resolution to this, because otherwise the game risks becoming fragmented. Like the attraction of the sport is having the best players compete against each other, and the less you have that happen, the less interesting it's going to be. So if Jay Monahan's going to exert some influence, then this must now be the time.
Before we move on from that, Sam, when you spoke about the normalization of Saudi Arabian investment into sport, and as you say, that sort of the outrage turns sometimes to resignation in some cases, but certainly turns towards normalization. And actually, that was probably the PGA Tour's strongest, I guess, element of public support, right? And that seems to diminish week by week almost. You know, if you think of the outrage towards, let's say, John Rahm compared to someone like an Ian Poulter, even though that, you know, they're almost at the opposite ends of the scale in terms of recent success anyway, it feels as if the PGA Tour's moral high ground is maybe too strong, but certainly that sort of that moral stand is being eroded away.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think any sort of moral high grounds the PGA Tour probably had fell from underneath it when it did the deal in the first place. Although there was kind of just an acceptance on their side that they just simply didn't have the pockets to sort of compete with LIV, and that eventually even those who were sort of turning it down would eventually defect. And as the move of John Rahm has kind of shown, I suppose there's been a number of reasons for the delay. Rumbling away in the background has been the talk of the other investment the PGA Tour has been trying to secure, which I know that it did just before Christmas, sort of chose, I think it was Strategic Sports Group, it chose to advance investment talks with, who it wants to be part of the final deal. And I mean, some people will probably be looking at that thinking, well, if you can get external investment in the first place, then why do you need to do this deal with the PIF? But then I think another way it's being perceived is a way of kind of like smoothing it over with Congress and then sort of providing those guarantees that the PGA is ultimately still going to be in control once this agreement is finalised and it isn't going to be Saudi Arabia. But yeah, I think the one thing that can be guaranteed is that Monahan is going to be doing something of significance in probably the first half of this year. I'd probably still argue that, you know, his own stock fell quite significantly last year after all of those statements that he made about, you know, essentially never doing business with Saudi Arabia. And even when you looked at sort of, I guess, the way the deal was structured when it was first announced, with Yasser Al-Rumayyan being chairman of the new commercial entity, Monahan being CEO of that, it almost felt a little bit like his power was being diluted in some way. And you do sort of wonder, even with all the assurances that they'll no doubt be providing to Congress and whoever else, it is hard to believe that, you know, the PGA will truly be the ones in charge of this once it's over. But I think for now, until that deal is done, Monahan definitely is going to have a big say in what happens next. And he needs to, because as Tom said, golf needs clarity. And the longer this rumbles on, there's no clarity for fans, there's no clarity for broadcasters, sponsors, players, etc. So it needs to be sorted out, or golf's just kind of going to fade into the background a little bit, I think. And it just feels a little bit like a reality show at the moment.
Yeah, it does at times. Let's turn our attention now to women's sports. And I want to start with the WTA, and in particular Marina Storti, who's the chief executive of the newly created WTA Ventures as well, on the back of the strategic partnership with private equity firm CVC Capital Partners. So Tom, 2023 was a big year for the WTA, celebrating its 50th anniversary. Do you want to run me through some of the key milestones outside of that we saw?
Yes, the major one I think that she has to deal with is that there's got to be some kind of replacement deal for the WTA's expired agreement with Perform Group, which was like a production and distribution deal, which was at the time when it was signed, like a decade ago, one of the biggest deals in sports and was viewed as fairly landmark. That ensured that all levels of the WTA Tour got significantly high quality broadcast done, which isn't a given within sports worldwide, as we all know well. In order to make sure that there is something that replaces that, maybe not on the same monetary level, if they've got this investment from CVC or they're able to grow their revenue streams from traditional rights sales, that can step in. But it does feel like it's a bit of a kind of inflection point for the WTA. We're at a point where tennis is almost deciding where to go. Like, does there need to be close alignment between the WTA and the ATP? I think so, but there's still questions there as to what that looks like. No one's yet come forward with a proposal that brings that all together in a meaningful way. This deal with CVC comes at a time where the WTA were one of the people that were attracting interest from Saudi investors, and instead managed to secure this partnership. Now, like, what does that mean? The Saudi money goes away? Does that mean that they pursue different investment from elsewhere? They've returned to China, which was a significant backer after a long-running dispute with Chinese authorities over the human rights of players, but most specifically the double star Peng Shuai. So there's a lot going on for the WTA, and to be launching this kind of in the middle of it to be having this going on. It's not like this needs to work or women's tennis goes away. Women's tennis is in a fairly strong position, I think, in terms of the players that it's got. It's just about creating that cohesive narrative. And this kind of continues that trend, I think, that we've seen a lot in recent years, where bodies that were set up for one purpose have found that they've evolved, and actually they now need to be updated and changed for the modern sports industry. Like the WTA was groundbreaking when it was first set up 50 years ago, but times have changed, and actually there needs to be probably a divide between organisation and commercialisation, and this is about that commercialisation of it. And yeah, Marina Storti has got a job on her hands doing it. There's a lot to sell. There's plenty going for the WTA. I think it's just bringing it all together and making it whole.
I know that she has significant experience from that sort of media rights landscape in her role at Now TV and at Sky previously. What do you think are some of the big opportunities in terms of that sale, particularly when it comes to the backdrop of discussions of potential merger between the ATP Tour and the WTA, Tom?
Well, I think we've seen a bit of this already, but like basically it's kind of about creating that year-long narrative that runs between the majors. The majors are the tentpole moments for tennis in the same way that they are for golf. But unlike in golf, women's majors and men's majors are played at the same time. On the regular tour events, there's only a handful of places where they do that. And I know there is moves to do that more. This will be about making sure that those events are given the prestige and given the correct windows and the commercial opportunities in order to be as impactful as they should be. Like if you're putting together the elite players from men's and women's tennis at the same time, albeit not at the major level, but still you've got them all in one place, in one tournament, in a dedicated time slot, that shouldn't be that hard to sell. It just seems to have been the case in recent years that it's not always worked out like that. Like they are coming back as well with a number of big name players this year, which is quite well timed. Naomi Osaka is coming back into the game this year. Emma Raducanu, who shone kind of short and bright, but is still a major draw, I think, is coming back this year. I think it feels like it's a good time for women's tennis. It's just getting those things all aligned and making sure that like they take the most of the opportunity.
I know when we talk to leaders within women's sports, the word that always comes back is investment. And it seems that the formation of WTA Ventures that's backed by a lot of that CVC funding of 150 million allows them to be a bit more innovative, and particularly in the digital space, a bit more dynamic in the way it can market and sell its product.
I think the fact that Storti has been appointed to that CEO role tells you a little bit about where they're going to be using that investment, essentially. So as you mentioned before, she was at Sky before this, background in media, was involved in the Now TV streaming platform, product development, all that kind of stuff. So I think as well as kind of, as Tom alluded to, she'll play a big role in sort of making sure that the WTA is maximising the value of its media rights. She'll also be probably responsible with either updating the WTA's existing digital platforms and probably launching new ones. And yeah, essentially creating new ways for the tour to engage with fans outside of the majors and throughout those tournaments across the year. Because as Tom mentioned, I don't think you see enough of women's tennis outside of those 4 major tournaments. I think the WTA has like a real opportunity here. And as I think basically the formation of WTA Ventures is a sign that there are people who believe that, the sport is still under commercialized, despite the fact that it is arguably one of the leading organizations in women's sport. There's still a lot of room for it to grow.
Let's stay stateside for a little while longer. And I want to talk about Cathy Engelbert, the commissioner of the WNBA, or the Women's National Basketball Association, who is also included on this list. And like its male counterpart in the NBA, media rights is probably the buzzword of 2024. Do you think, Sam?
Yeah, I think like the WNBA's media rights negotiations have probably sort of gone under the radar a little bit, just purely because of the interest in that NBA deal. But I think as well as media rights expansion is a big buzzword for WNBA right now. Engelbert's been there since 2019. There's always been rumored interest from cities who kind of do want a WNBA team, particularly in the last couple of years. And I guess there's kind of been a little bit of pressure on Engelbert in the sense that the NWSL, while the WNBA hasn't necessarily been expanding at quite the same rate, the NWSL has been adding teams sort of on an annual basis for the last few years. So I think a lot of people look at that and ask, why hasn't the WNBA been doing the same, given the ongoing investment being directed towards women's sport more generally and the interest from those cities that I just mentioned.
Why do you think that's the case?
I think there's probably a few reasons. I think Engelbert herself has said there was I think they had about 100 cities interested. And so there's a lot of due diligence that they had to do before they can kind of choose, which market they want to put a team in. I guess it's also making sure that you're getting a fair price. I think last year we started to see some valuations come out of WNBA teams. The Seattle Storm were valued at $151 million. Now, I don't think anyone's going to be paying $151 million for a WNBA team anytime soon. And we saw last year the Bay Area expansion franchise cost $50 million. So, maybe over the course of the last couple of years, there's been a bit of a gap in terms of what investors are willing to pay and what the WNBA thinks its expansion franchises are worth. So that's probably why, this next media rights deal is so important, because that's going to give investors the confidence that they are going to see that upside and they are going to see a return on their investment further down the line. So I think, it's a big year for Engelbert, because these delays to expansion have been criticised by players because there are always roster cuts at the start of every season. And players have sort of said publicly they need more slots on the roster so that players can ultimately earn a living from playing women's basketball. So, there's pressure from that perspective. And also there's pressure because of what the NWSL just did with its media rights deal, right? They secured a 40-fold annual increase, $240 million in total. The WNBA already gets something like $30 million a year from ESPN. But Engelbert will be expected to deliver a significant increase on that and kind of convince investors that the WNBA is the place for them to be and sort of to set up a team.
I'm going to once again ask you to go for Nostradamus on me, Sam, but if we're looking at the NWSL as a 40-fold increase, what kind of region are you expecting for the WNBA?
I'm not that guy. I don't work for Octagon or any of those agencies who value media rights. But I guess the thing to say is that the NWSL's 40-fold increase, it was starting from a much lower point in that its media rights were worth $2.5 million annually. So to jump to 60 million a year, the increase was always going to be a lot more, whereas the WNBA started from sort of 30 odd million. So I think if it can kind of, it depends how much inventory it puts up for grabs as well, how the packages are structured, etc. But I mean, if it can, double that, I think it'll be pretty satisfied. I could be wrong. They could be wanting a lot more, but I think, depending on the length of that deal, if they kind of do a deal that's similar amount of time to the one that the NWSL has done, I think doubling that would be a sort of pretty good return. I don't know if Tom, who's our media rights guru, would agree with that.
Yeah, I thought you were going to go full politician on me there, Sam, when you were giving all of the various disclaimers. But glad to see we pinned you down to a rough number by the end. Tom, do you kind of roughly agree with that? Think Sam's wildly off the cards there?
No, I don't think he's wildly off the cards. I think he's also right to say that like the 40-fold increases that is all about starting from a low base. I think as well, partly these deals will be about probably finding a bit more of a balance between, at times, what's been a fairly kind of confusing broadcast picture for the WNBA. Their games have been in a number of places, but for something that is still growing, do you want to make it as easy as possible for fans to find it, right? You'd want to make sure they retain that big network presence with the likes of an ESPN. I'm sure they'd love to keep the ABC element of that. And where possible, I mean, it's a very young facing league, so a streaming product would make sense, and Amazon would make sense. Peacock probably makes sense. I mean, you could sit here and just list through like major sports networks or major networks in the US. So
I was enjoying hearing you
they all make sense in some degree, but like
you should be on the WNBA sales team, Tom.
I thought you were going to say I should be on the Stream Time podcast, but no one listens to that, so I wouldn't worry about it.
It's new year, new us. We're all being friendly now.
Okay, sorry, I didn't get that memo. It will be one of those agreements that is measured slightly in the monetary value, because the viewership has been going up, and that's been the narrative around women's sports. I think probably, as with most media rights deals in 2024, they might not be as big as we were probably predicting 6 to 12 months ago.
Yeah. Although, given the back of the extraordinary interest in the women's March Madness, the demand is there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And like that should be a sales tool for the WNBA. You wouldn't go to market with these. It's like, these are the players that are coming into our league. If these are the guys that are getting the eyeballs, then if you can't sell that, then you're the problem.
Let's finish our discussion on women's sports with a property a little closer to home, with Nikki Doucet, the chief executive of the also newly formed Women's Super League NewCo. This comes off the back of the independent review of women's football that was undertaken by Karen Carney and others. And the government, I think, unanimously accepted all of her recommendations, one of which was the establishment of NUCO, which is a new governing body. But can you take me through the journey to how we've got there and sort of what NUCO is now tasked with, and, you know, some of the big things that we're going to see in Nikki Doucet's intro, I guess, once NUCO takes over the governance of women's football from the 2024-25 season?
NUCO has kind of always been the direction of travel for the WSL for quite a while. The FA, which has run the competition up until when NUCO will take over, from the start of the 2024-25 season. The FA has been running it up until now, but I don't think the FA has made any secret of the fact that it kind of wants the WSL to become its own independent entity in the same way that, you know, the Premier League is its own independent entity. And I think it's obviously the right step. The FA is there to sort of govern the sport. It shouldn't necessarily be tasked with commercialising it as well. It needs a sort of company dedicated to doing that, which is what NUCO will be doing. It's a positive step for the WSL, and it will sort of be the next stage in its commercial development, I suppose. And I think Doucet was linked with the CEO role a while ago. She was linked to the role sort of from early in 2023, and then confirmation came in November with the announcement of that new company. And I think her appointment was actually greeted with quite a lot of optimism. She's had quite a varied background across a number of roles, which are going to serve her pretty well, I think, in that chief executive position. So her most recent major role was with Nike, where she held a variety of positions, but obviously that's going to sort of help with, she'll have some expertise in terms of how the league can be marketed to grow its audience, but also she has a bit of a background in investment banking, in private equity as well. And there's been a lot of talk about sort of, you know, private equity firms investing in WSL to accelerate its growth. So you have to imagine that sort of those experiences will stand her in good stead to deal with those negotiations if they are to arise. So someone who has a pretty wide-ranging skill set basically is taking on this role, and clearly is going to play a massive part in the WSL's commercial growth. Perhaps the biggest thing in her intro for this year is probably going to be the next broadcast deal, which is expiring soon.
Yeah, it certainly feels like a bit of a sliding doors moment in terms of the, you know, able to attract the investment and the sort of that commercial entity that's able to really take the WSL to the next level, that, you know, requires more funding than a sort of a governing body such as the FA is able to provide. So going into that new media rights cycle from 24-25, what do you think are the expectations the WSL should have there? And also, what about the impact of the recent Premier League rights deal and EFL rights deal that hugely increases the number of games being broadcast, and therefore, you know, there's the potential to sort of cannibalize those footballing audiences? Or do you think there's more to it than that?
We are going to probably see slightly more fragmentation amongst who broadcast the games. I think Sky, and we got this, I think, from our conversation with Joe Osborne, George, they are pretty keen on keeping this. But in the next couple of years, they've got to find space on their channels for a lot more EFL games, a lot more Premier League games, that amongst returning investments in tennis too. They're very much back in on that. Basically, Sky Sports has got a lot of things to find places to put. As good a job as it's done with WSL and as popular as it's been, and as well as that was worked on there, it will need to carve out specific times to show those games, or otherwise it's not going to have that same kind of influence. What they will say is that what we've done, it creates great runways for us to showcase the WSL. We can go, here's our primetime game on a Saturday afternoon, or a Sunday 2 p.m. or a Sunday 4:30. Straight afterwards, here's a WSL game for the same audience to watch. That does work and has been a successful strategy for them. Where this is all leading in my head is that I think that the 3 p.m. blackout will probably go for the WSL, and that is where it will open up a window for another broadcaster to come in. I think the
Sky have already said they're not particularly keen on pursuing that option, given they have other flagship properties.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they're still pretty happy with Soccer Saturday. So George is frowning at me. I'm a Soccer Saturday fan who's not. But there is no more BT Sport Score, and that has not been moved on to TNT Sports since the channel's rebranded. So there is an opportunity there, I think. And yeah, BT was previously a broadcaster. It let that go when the required investment went up, but this could be a good moment for them to come back in and say, yeah, we'll take those games at 3 o'clock on a Saturday. Unique window. No one else showing football at that time. a real chance to stamp their mark with that property. So that could be where some of that additional revenue comes from in the deal. You'd like to think that there would be increased investment anyway, because the current agreement has showed the value of the WSL to the broadcasters. So yeah, I think what we'll end up with is probably 2 pay TV broadcasters and still a free-to-air option, because frankly, I think the WSL knows that league still needs reach. And this is where the decisions that Nicky Doucet makes will come to bear. But I think the direction of travel is probably there. I think it would be too soon to completely cut off the reach that you get from free to air. But that's a decision that she'll have to make. And if I was someone taking on a job in the sports industry right now, this would be one of the ones that I'd want.
Yeah, I think it'd be top of my list too. I think that might be all we have time for. I know there are plenty of other names that would be good to discuss, and perhaps one for our listeners to go and read about at their own leisure. Sam and Tom, thank you very much for joining me as ever. There's no other way that I'd want to start my 2024 other than sat back in the hosting hot seat chatting to you two enlightened gentlemen. But thank you for your time as always, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks, George. Can I just get a quick plug in for the feature? It is available out now on the .com. It will have gone into your inboxes today via the Daily. We'll be plugging it all over our channels. This is not the only way in which you can consume SportsPro's 10 influencers, but it's one of them. And we hope you enjoyed it.
Cheers, guys.